Well, hello. Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Alistair Rock. I'm Executive Director of AIIA Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever we may be, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, warm welcome to members of AIIA, both here in Dyson House and online, to our other guests and members of the diplomatic corps joining us. We'll take questions towards the end. We'll go around the room with a roving mic and on Zoom, usual thing, put them in the Q&A tab and we'll get to as many as we have time for. So to discuss the topic of the end of security multilateralism in Asia and what it means for the region and the world, it's a privilege to welcome Professor Nick Bisley from La Trobe. However, as this is a Fellows Address, I'd like to invite Zara Kimpton, AIIA National Vice President, to briefly explain the process of the Fellow Award and to make the presentation to Nick. Zara, all yours.
Thank you, Alistair. In 2008, at the time of the 75th anniversary of the AIIA as a national organisation, the AIIA decided to launch a Fellows Program. The overriding criterion for selection is a very high level of distinction in and distinguished contribution to international relations. Since 2008, 109 Australians from around the country have been admitted as fellows, of which 30 have been are or were based in Victoria. You can see a list of these people on our national website if you would like to know more about them. And I've actually left a list of them on the table at the back of this room for those who would like to have a look as well. Nick Bisley was made a fellow in 2020 for his distinguished contribution to education and the national discussion on foreign affairs, particularly in Asia. The recent lockdowns caused by the COVID epidemic has meant that we had to wait until now to present Nick with his award. Nick Bisley is now the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of International Relations at La Trobe University, having previously been the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia. He's also Secretary of the Council of Australasian Deans of Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. He's a member of the Advisory Board of China Matters and a member of the Council for Security and Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. He has been a Senior Research Associate of the International Institute of Strategic Studies and a visiting fellow of the East-West Centre in Washington, D.C. Nick is the author of many works on international relations and is a regular contributor to national and international media. People are not made fellows of the AIIA for their involvement with our institute, but in Nick's case, he has in fact made an important contribution to the work of this institute. From 2013 to 18, he was the editor of our own Australian Journal of International Affairs, the country's oldest scholarly journal in the field of international relations. He is still on the journal board and in fact a co-author of an article in the April 2022 issue on Australian foreign policy in the 21st century. During his time as journal editor, he also sat on our national board. We regard Nick as an important friend of the AIIA. Each new fellow of the Institute is invited to address our members at the time he or she is presented with their award. Nick's research and teaching expertise is in Asia's international relations, great power politics, and Australian foreign and defence policy. It is therefore no surprise that he has chosen as his topic today the end of security multilateralism in Asia, what it means for the region's future in the world. Before we learn about this topic, please join me in congratulating Nick as I present him with the awarded Honorary Fellowship of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Congratulations.
I feel like I should hold up my
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Nick. No, I'm going to take it away from you. We'll pack it up in a box for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. When I was informed I was had been elected as a fellow, I was taken a bit back because apart from anything, you don't tend to think of these things, but much more important, it's an honour to which I had associated people of a certain age, which meant that I could come to a certain age, which I'm increasingly making my peace with. But it is a real honour and a privilege to be part of the group. You see, look at who's in, who are fellows, and feel somewhat humbled to be in their company. But also the Institute has been a really important part of my professional life. I think it's played an enormously significant part in the nation's sort of public engagement with international affairs, and has been a really significant component of, I think, some of the recent debates and discussions, both as a platform in which we've talked about some of the controversial issues, but also a way in which we can engage with and talk about diverse groups. I tend often to talk about a pretty narrow band of people in and around academia and policy circles, and the great strength of the Institute is the diverse range of backgrounds that people have who come and participate in events like this. So thank you, it's a real honour, but as I said, it's slightly daunting for a range of different reasons. So to turn to the topic of my
Alistair, it's supposed to actually count here. Can you turn it on?
Oh, do you mean I can project more?
Okay.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Let me know if I need to speak up. That's
Yeah,
great.
good. That's better. That's better.
So what I want to do my remarks this evening is provide what I think is a bit of a post-mortem of Asia's security multilateralism, and as the title said, what this might mean for the region and the world. In doing so, I really want to kind of take it in three parts. I want to start by providing a sketch of what Asian security multilateralism is or was, the kind of what and why, or how it emerged and why it emerged, and then explain why it is I think is dead or dying, and the causes that have propelled that, and then get to the point about what does this all mean, bearing in mind that I think we're in the early days of this demise, and so consequences and drawing conclusions may need to be necessarily a little cautious and a little moderated, because it's difficult to get a sense of perspective on these sorts of things. But to start, when I say something is dead or ended, what is the it that has come to the conclusion of its life? The focus here is Asia's security multilateralism. It's probably useful to start with a bit of context, and that's, I guess, to begin with the observation that Asia was a part of the world which came relatively late to multilateralism. Multilateralism was probably one of the big diplomatic developments in international affairs after the Second World War. It became the centerpiece of the United Nations systems, and wherever you looked in the world, whether it's Western Europe, Latin America, the Persian Gulf, and other parts of the decolonizing world, multilateralism pretty rapidly became part of what states were doing. East Asia was a bit of an exception to this. ASEAN appeared in 1967. It was really the only thing that was happening in the region. A few little bits around the margins, you might say the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council was there, sort of quietly in the background. But in terms of sort of interstate, the management of interstate relations, the region was not a significant player in the multilateral game. It came late, but when it found it got a pretty significant degree of enthusiasm for multilateral agreements. And what we saw really after the Cold War period was an expansion of multilateral institutions and organizations in Asia, and principally in East Asia, I'm focusing my remarks on, that lasted roughly 15 years. And so the period I would identify as the kind of flowering of security multilateralism really begins in 1994 with the creation of the ASEAN Regional Forum and reaches its sort of full breadth, if you like, with the accession of the United States and the Russian Federation to the East Asia Summit in 2011. But this was, of course, part of a wider array of multilateralism in the region. So it wasn't just we saw groups getting together to talk about how they could cooperate and talk about security cooperation. We saw an expansion of trade, investment, collaboration, creation of organizations like APEC and so on. The component elements of Asia security multilateralism were pretty broad ranging. You had the creation of formal institutions. You saw the creation of what might be described as kind of platforms or processes in which states got together to talk about things that didn't have the kind of formal bricks and mortar, if you like, of and constitutional structures of more formal institutions. There was a group, probably the most prominent of which, that was centered around ASEAN, sort of ASEAN-centered groups, or some people refer to them somewhat impolitely as ASEAN outgrowths, which I think has a kind of deliberately pejorative sound to it. Probably the three most notable here were the ASEAN Regional Forum, which would be the first of these from the mid-1990s, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Agreement, which then rapidly expanded out to the ASEAN ADMM Plus, in that something of a mouthful, ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus process, and of course the East Asia Summit, which was first established at its first meeting in Kuala Lumpur in 2005, and then steadily expanded to its current membership, as I said, at the outset in 2011. Alongside the ASEAN-centered bodies, you also had a group of minilaterals, a slightly unlovely phrase that refers to kind of smallish groups, usually 2, 3, 4. The general contrast being multilateral are big, expansive, potentially comprehensive in their membership, minilateral being smaller, narrower, often functionally specific. And as part during this period from the mid-90s to the early 2010s, we saw the trilateral security dialogue established, which is Australia, Japan, United States. The first version of the Quad, established in 2001, and then rapidly walked away from by most members in 2008. To which I would also add the six-party talks in relation to the North Korean nuclear crisis, which is a really interesting, and I think actually understudied component of regional multilateralism. So any prospective PhD students out there, there's a project in that or two. And you might even also add the Proliferation Security Initiative, something that's now feels like it's a little while ago, but was a multilateral effort of the Bush administration to corral and control the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, in particular missile technology, but a range of other things. Then we even had APEC, which was originally, and to this day remains, focused ostensibly on economic cooperation, but had in its early days very firmly said, we will do economic cooperation and nothing else, and try and draw a really firm line between the technical business of trade cooperation and political cooperation and security cooperation, because, for the obvious, so perfectly understandable reason that if you brought too much politics and security to the table, the difficult business of cutting trade deals would be completely scuppered. But in the wake of 9/11, what now feels like a long while ago, in the war on terror, even APEC began to recognize that an organization like it couldn't keep security out, and had a range of initiatives trying to essentially secure ports, supply chains, and supply lines from the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Alongside this, he also saw the PRC begin to experiment in institution building and leading a number of initiatives, the most successful of which, you probably put an asterisk around successful, because in a lot of these things, success is a little business, but was the creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2001, which was intended to provide geopolitical stability in the former Soviet states of Central Asia, which, and now as we look back on this creation in the context of Putin and Xi Jinping's no limits friendship, this looks like actually a particularly shrewd, forward-thinking initiative, focused really on, but focused in many respects on strong, re-establishing strong state capability in part of the world where Russia and China had felt that weak states with poor governance were providing security concerns to their interests. And she also led in 2014, one of my more embarrassing moments as an external expert in international relations was being in Shanghai in May 2014 with my vice chancellor and a number of other senior folk from the university, and driving down one of the many major roads from the airport, sort of ring roads around Shanghai, and there's these flags flapping, which says the International Summit of CICCA. And my vice chancellor turns to me and says, "What's this? You should know about this." Yes, John. And of course, this is, as you will all doubtless be aware, now Pradeep knows, but I suspect he's probably the only one.
Asia for Asians.
Asia for Asians with the speech, and kick a prize if anyone can tell me what PICA stands for. This is a Conference on Integration and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. Rolls off the tongue. But this is where she stood up and gave probably the first big speech, which was of what has come to be a pretty familiar kind of coded language that the PRC uses to say we want a region in which the US is not the preeminent power, and maybe we want a region in which we are the preeminent power. But certainly we're clear that non-Asian states should not be the keepers of the peace or the balancers of the power. And as Pradeep helpfully pointed out, he said, yeah, Asian security should be determined by Asian people and Asian states, which not especially subtle. As a platform, KICA has made some contributions, but probably wouldn't put it much more than that. Plus, of course, there are two famous failed efforts to drive more security cooperation in the region. Kevin Rudd's Asia Pacific Community Program, which I can bore you at length with various parts of the set piece diplomacy, or such as it may be, that was part of that in 2009, as I was involved in some of the discussions. And then roughly at the same time, Japanese Prime Minister Hatoyama also floated an idea of his version of an East Asian community. So there was clearly something in the air in that 2008, 2009, 2010 period that said, we're in some challenging moments in bringing states together to think about, talk about security challenges and advance shared security goals was something that people were interested in. So what that led us to by that 2011 period was an international stage that was pretty cluttered. Some scholars began to use and commentators began to use what I think is the rather polite phrase, but entirely misleading and deceptive in terms of its grasp on reality, which is to describe what the region had as a security architecture. Now, any architect who presented a set of designs that looked like the mishmash of institutions I've just described and all the other things would probably have their Australian Institute of Architects accreditation taken away from them promptly. But it was a useful shorthand, whatever you may think of the utility of the metaphor, to describe this kind of mix of mechanisms. I think Victor Cha at the time wrote an interesting piece describing it as a patchwork quilt, which is probably getting still a reasonably polite version of things, but getting closer to the slightly disjointed, slightly homespun, certainly not particularly well coordinated ways in which different mechanisms in the region were appearing. What we also had as part of this mix were really a combination of what you might describe as liberally inspired mechanisms, that's to say institutions, processes, and efforts to drive cooperation and to try to find common ground and what Chinese might describe as win-win or mutually beneficial or positive sum gain versions of how we might cooperate, and trying to find incentives to get states to do things together. But you also had, this is of course the business of security cooperation, you had more realist-inspired things going along as well, saying actually we're a little bit uneasy about the significant build-up of the Chinese military, for example, which had been, by 2010 in its probably third decade of a modernization program, the early part of the third decade of a modernization program, and its capability were really clearly significantly more than they had been in the late 1990s. And on this latter front, of course, notwithstanding the fact that we'd had a significant growth of these multilateral institutions at which, if you went to any of the meetings, if you read any of the communiques, were filled with the language of, common security and humanitarian disaster relief and, collaborative, non-traditional security operations and a whole range of things like that, you still had probably the most important set of security arrangements in the region being America's bilateral alliances. You had the presence of American military capacity, which probably still at that point was the preeminent military force in the region, and its series of relationships with South Korea, Japan, Australia, the quasi-alliance relationships with Singapore and a number of others. So, it was very clearly had a very, very clear realist component to it, or inspired by fairly conventional realist thinking around how to manage security challenges in the region. And At that point, so this is this early 2010s, you still had some uncertainty though, notwithstanding the fact that it was a conventional military alliances that are about shared threats, generally thought of in conventional military terms. You still had a sense that the alliance system as a whole hadn't quite worked out a clear overarching purpose in a post-Cold War, as yet not into where we are now, version of what Asia looked like. So that it talked about and dabbled with things like providing regional stability, or that the alliances served global purposes. So if you look back at the way Australia was talking about its alliance with the United States at that time, it was much less about the kinds of things we talk about now, so the threat from China of the South Pacific, for example, and much more about making contributions to global security in places like Afghanistan and the like. So that whilst they were bilateral and realist in their kind of inclinations, there was still some uncertainty about what the whole thing was for. And we were still at that point in that early 2010s where America thought it could figure out a way to get along with China in the long run, partly informed by a sense that I think it still prevailed in Washington at that time, that China was never really going to prevent a significant, clear competitive threat to the United States. They still hadn't quite fully gotten the sense that a country like China could ever be like the Soviet Union, for example, to present a kind of existential challenge to American interests. And equally, those multilaterals that I was referring to earlier, also, whilst they had a kind of realist inclination about them, still weren't quite sure what they were all about. So part of the reason Quad 1 doesn't last particularly long is that there isn't a clear consensus about just what it's for. And partly it's China looks very different in 2008 than it looks now, or 2017 when it got revived. Partly there's still a sense that the regional order could probably be managed with American predominance. You probably don't need to do China-containing coalitions. And if you're not doing China-containing coalition, what purpose does a Quad of those four countries at that particular time serve, given the pretty limited ways in which those four countries could work together? And so at the time, the multilaterals, this is this 2010, 2011, which are inclusive, they're all designed to be open. They're designed mostly at that point, designed probably a little strong to be clear, but they're intended to be open to members. They're not pointed at anyone. They're broadly cooperative in the way they're designed to be approaching security challenges. And they've worked out a kind of modus operandi where if anything's really too difficult to talk about amongst the group, they just don't talk about it. So that the East Asia Summit can talk about security challenges because they just don't talk about something like Taiwan, which is clearly right at the heart of the matter today. And so what you have is this weird mix of cooperative and inclusive, some sort of exclusive and competitive, but they're still not sure what they're competing over. There's some thoughts in the background of some people in some of the countries. So Abe in 2007, he's a bit ahead of the curve in the sense that he's looking out across the region and thinking, I'm uneasy about what China represents, but he's not finding a lot of resonance out there, certainly not in Australia. And don't forget, it wasn't Rudd who was the most resistant to the Quad. Howard was very uneasy about the Quad. Howard, by all accounts, to certain people I've spoken to involved in Washington at the time, had to be kind of talked into participating in the Quad in the first instance because of, not unreasonable perception at the time that this was going to ruffle the feathers in Beijing, and this was Australia's aims at that time had been, we want to have really positive relations with all of the region's great powers. That's China and the United States and Japan and India. It's a difficult game to try to play, but at that time it made a certain kind of sense. So why did all of this stuff appear? There was a number of factors at work that brought all of these multilateral institutions to the surface at this point in time. One of which was a growing awareness of the complex forms of vulnerability that globalisation had opened up. So that as the states of the region become increasingly economically integrated with one another, by the early 2010s, Asia is beginning to trade and invest with one another. Prior to in the 90s and even the early 2000s, there was not a lot of intra-East Asian trade and investment. It was largely investment coming from North America and Western Europe into the region, creating things, exporting back to those markets. The amount of trade across the region was relatively limited. as they begin to trade from one another, they begin to see economic benefit, but also risks around transnational threats to do with infectious disease, to do with crime, terrorism, and the like. And they go, well, we have complex problems with which we now have vulnerabilities we didn't used to have. It's benefits, but we need to figure out how to manage them. We can't do it alone. If you go and look at what they talked about at that time, a lot of it was about trying to figure out how you deal with the vulnerabilities of what the globalisation has opened up. The second reason was also a kind of more classically kind of liberal motivation for creating multilateral institutions. So that is, you get together so as to improve communication, you know who the people are, you know who your interlocutors are on the other side. So when the crisis hits, you know that you've met Minister X or Senior Official Y before, and you have a rapport with them and you can communicate more effectively in the heat of the moment. You're able to build trust slowly over time and establish hopefully some kind of sense of common cause amongst the group. So the classic kind of, if we communicate better with one another, if we understand one another's motives and interests, we can manage our relations better. And multilateral institutions seems a platform to do this, to provide these positive benefits. But there was also a realization at that time that things were changing, that the balance of power was beginning to shift. And a power transition, as the sort of language of some of the theorists, began to be realized as a real thing that was happening, and not just a flight of fantasy or of something with which to be resisted, but was going to create a much more complex geopolitical environment which needed to be managed to some degree. And of course, the multilateral instincts, particularly coming out of ASEAN, was if we can bring the major powers into the tent, we can help shape how they relate to us and to the region as a whole. Now, to be clear, no one was sort of naive and felt like if we bring America and China, and maybe Russia and India as well, into the East Asia Summit, everything will be okay. I mean, no one thought that, but there was certainly a belief that this is a period of power transition and we need to do everything we can to manage these relationships to the extent to which we can. So that was, and you did see at some of the more kind of Baroque moments, someone like Rudd, who thought, you know, what you could do is establish an institution to manage order. And remember, this was the first time we saw Hugh White pop his head over the parapets was in 2009, writing his first quarterly essay, which in which he made the case at the end of it to say, what does Asia need? It needs a concept of power. It needs a managed order in which the great powers essentially recreate what happened in Europe in the post-Napoleonic period to work out diplomatic settlement to manage crises, which has a certain kind of appeal, one can admit. I don't think anyone thought it was practical at the time, or to this day, but you did see that even at that time, you began to see scholars and writers say, here's a way in which we can deal with a region in which you don't have American primacy, in which you have a number of major powers, in which you've got a complex set of challenges that need to be managed. So we have a complex picture in front of us. On the one hand, we still have the bilateral alliances. But on the other hand, we have this huge array of multilateral institutions. And I wrote a small book for the IISS that came out in 2009, I think, at which I felt like every time I turned around, it was a new idea, a new institution, a new acronym that I had to figure out what it did, what it was, who was needed, who was out. And in it, there's a kind of cut out and keep chart which shows who the members are, who's a member of what the briefing is, and what the overlap looks like. And there's a sort of, there's like a cottage industry of those diagrams. So it's pretty complex and pretty messy. But at more optimistic moments, we thought, okay, these aren't perfect, but surely some combination of these things is going to work and provide us with a reasonably stable way, reasonably predictable, reasonably effective way of creating or sustaining, don't forget, sustaining a stable regional order. Because of course, we hadn't had interstate warfare in East Asia since 1979, not inconsiderable feat. But even at your kind of most optimistic, if you looked closely at what we had at that point in time, tensions were evident and problems were pretty close to the surface. The resources were spread pretty thin. I remember going to a, what was it? It was essentially a sort of 2-day planning session for Brunei's first defence white paper. And I was sitting at lunch next to this guy and talking about what to do. He said, I'm in the Air Force. I'm like, so the Air Force, you fly planes. I'm in charge of the Air Force. Oh, you're in charge of the Air Force. And I totally realised I've got all of the Brunei chiefs of force named in the Air Force and there's the chief of the Defence Force. And I was like, huh. And I said, well, what do you think of all these institutions in the region that you have to go to? Well, I have to go to another meeting. He's like, look at us, we don't have time for this. We don't have the resources for this. Now, of course, it's an extreme example, Brunei being at the smaller end, but also the more resource end. There's not a lot of them, but they've got plenty of cash to throw at the problem. So it was already, the resources were spread pretty thin. So if you're kind of just looking at how much do you value this? And of course, great deal also really hinged on domestic sort of convergence of domestic political interests. It happened to be at that point in time that in most of the countries in the region, the elites in the foreign defense policy bureaucracies, as well as in the political offices, thought this all seemed to be a reasonably good idea. But if, as you probably see where I'm going with this, that focal point began to broaden out, if interests began to be taken elsewhere by financial crises, conflicts, and the like, pandemic, then we might be in a somewhat different world. So why have I gone from that to the point where I'm on the slide, which says it's all over? That's to say we've reached the end of the line. Probably to be really clear from the start, what I think as we've reached the end of the road is the inclusive cooperative version of regional security cooperation. And in some respects, where is the energy? It's in multilateralism, but it's in that unilateral version of interstate cooperation. It's in Quad 2.0, it's in AUKUS trilaterals, it's in these small gatherings of states that are doing this, that are what I would describe as competitive and exclusive, in contrast to being cooperative and inclusive. But you say the East Asia Summit meets. Penny Wong was just at the East Asia Summit Foreign Ministers meeting, where feathers were ruffled on various kinds. The Chinese waggle our fingers and we waggle them back. Now, the regional institutions go on in name. And as Alan Gingell, who I'm promised is online, listening in, taking notes, and doubtless writing, already penning me a furious rebuttal email, wrote in a really good paper about in the lead up to Australia's APEC hosting in 2007. I knew I did that wrong. He and Malcolm Cook described APEC at the time as at risk of becoming a zombie institution. And one thing you learn if you study multilateral institutions is they very rarely die, but they often die in all but name. Corpses staggering the landscape of international relations. And I think that's what we're going to have here, which is to say the East Asia Summit will continue to meet, continue to issue ever longer joint press releases, although they finally get shorter, they're getting very, very long. But as substantive contributors to what you might describe as regional security public goods, I think their ability to deliver much, if anything, has basically come to an end. What are the reasons I have for reaching this conclusion? What's the empirical evidence that says the heartbeat is gone or sufficiently gone as to warrant a declaration of death of one form or another? One is just that basic question of resource allocation and political commitment. It's extremely low. If you look at all of the key supporters of these organizations, the amount of time and energy and effort that they are putting in, look at how much bureaucratic resource is committed to it. Is there a branch that's focused on it? How much time of bureaucrats is spent on these organizations? How much Sherpa work, that sort of the ground preparation that the officials take in the lead up to these organizations' meetings. It's very, very low. It's not at absolute zero, but it's pretty which is pretty underwhelming compared to where we were a dozen or so years ago. The second is, what have they done for us? And I don't mean to say that in a kind of flippant way, but literally. And I think probably the most striking, to me, the two most striking illustrations of the problems of these institutions has been, or these multilateral security mechanisms, is that they've fundamentally failed the core test of things that are not particularly hard or politically challenging. So not hard, but difficult, but not politically challenging in security. So the thing that all of these institutions said that they could do and do well and do easily is humanitarian disaster relief. And none of these organizations, the ASEAN Regional Forum, has ever produced anything effective in relation to humanitarian disaster relief, even when, I think in 2008 or 2009, when they'd done an exercise, this was considered to be a significant achievement, that after very careful effort and alignment arrangement and lots of meetings, the ASEAN Regional Forum organized a exercise to do humanitarian disaster relief in a sort of mocked up super typhoon hitting the south of the Philippines, which they did successfully. Then 6 weeks later, an actual typhoon actually hit the exact same part of the Philippines. And who came to the rescue? The United States Navy. Fast forward to the pandemic. The biggest health security challenge to face the region. And what did the region's security institutions do? Nothing. They could not even issue a press release. Now, to be clear, it's a high bar because I think a lot of things failed in the pandemic. But what it really graphically illustrated was that cooperative and collaborative instinct, when faced with a big, complex problem, completely and utterly failed. And then do the thought experiment, which is imagine a future challenge. Imagine another super typhoon, an energy crisis, or choose the security challenge of your preferred kind, and imagine what these might do realistically and how they might respond. And I'd be very pleased to hear if you can game that out and go, the East Asia Summit will make a tangible contribution. Or even the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus process, which was established to be really clear, to bring defence officials together to talk about concrete areas in which defence people could do things. And even they have failed to make a significant contribution. And what we've got, I think, ultimately is a circumstance in which these mechanisms have been outcompeted for the interest of their members and outcompeted in the kinds of security challenges that the region faces in terms of what they can deliver. To use a somewhat hacky metaphor, if you imagine a paddock that was once filled with lovely grass, it's all of a sudden gone to seed and the weeds have grown up because the weeds are able to flourish in those conditions much more effectively than the grass, unless you tend them and manage them, and I wouldn't push it too far. So essentially the bilateral security alliances of the United States and the minilateral competitive and exclusive forms of cooperation are wildly outcompeting these big, expansive, comprehensive mechanisms. Now, why is this the case? What's the reason? And I think this is a case where when you're in the social sciences, we have this term, which is if you're looking to work out the causes of something, if there are so many causes that you can't pin one down, you declare that it is overdetermined. And it might be the case that the end of security multilateralism in Asia may be a little overdetermined. But I'd point to sort of probably 4 broad categories of causes. I think the first was just something I was alluding to earlier, and that is to do with the problems of design and coordination. Even as we had new organizations appearing, I was saying earlier, I felt as if when I was writing that piece that every time you turned around there was a new press release. Even at that time, you thought, hang on, we've got these mechanisms that have got mostly similar members. So the APEC talking about security, it's got pretty similar membership to the East Asia Summit, and the ASEAN Regional Forum's also got very significant overlap. Yes, there's some others who aren't there, but so just the questions of membership, remit, work programs and the poor design and and the spreading out of resources just meant that they were always going to be facing significant challenges, just right from the start. So the less I think there had been what you might describe as a kind of form of urban planning with this disorganized kind of almost organic expansion of these mechanisms, unless someone sat down and said, okay, let's get rid of this one, and this one, and focus our efforts on these ones. I think it was always going to be a very difficult set of circumstances. So if we were to turn the clock forward from 2010, and in particular, let's turn the clock forward from 2012 and imagine a China in which Xi Jinping doesn't become a leader, but we get a Hu Jintao 2.0. We get a continuation of the Baidu time, Baidu cause, and liberal engagement with the liberal world order is something with which China can make peace. These things still would have found life difficult because of that basic kind of structural problem around membership and design and coordination. The second problem was just around capabilities in general. So that's to say, the problem I was alluding to earlier, which is can you deliver, creates a sort of classic political problem around expectation management. And also people will invest in these things to the extent to which they think they deliver. And because they're not delivering, they're not investing in it. So people, you have a collective problem when you're trying to bring 16, 20, 23 states together to say, we are going to work together to manage common problems. When they look at it and senior officials in the Australian government go, that's a pretty good name for that thing because it's just, and you think, okay, when the officials who are tasked with managing it think it's acronym silly, it's an anecdote, but it's something which is illustrative of this sort of cycle of enthusiasm or a cycle of disengagement. And we saw in that early period, there was small amounts of enthusiasm that drew more membership in and participation, but as the disengagement became more widespread, we're in that kind of more vicious cycle, if you like, or downward spiral of disengagement. A third problem was one of leadership. Successful multilateral institutions of whatever kind, whether they're about security or whether they're about economic cooperation or regional integration, only work well when there's clear leadership sustained over a period of time. There's lots of different ways in which that leadership can be managed. It can be bureaucratic, it can be political, it can be about elites getting together. And of course, think about ASEAN, by far the most long-lived regional multilateral institution in East Asia. Its success in the early days of the Cold War was a function of the leadership. Now, it wasn't charismatic external leadership, it was about elite collaboration in the post-colonial, in the Cold War space, as you had these states, authoritarian one-party dictatorships, that's really clear. They're trying to carve out a shared space in the complex terrain of the Cold War and doing it, managing that leadership and expectations very effectively. We have not had any of that in these organizations have seemingly suffered from a lack of leadership and a lack of shared vision amongst the major powers, or even a shared vision amongst a group of middle powers. I think you could have had, I don't think that you needed to have the US and China, a sort of G2 concord to make these things work. But you did need to have a clear consensus amongst key players and a desire and a shared vision as to what these organizations would be doing and a capacity to drive that and convince others, whether it's quietly on the sides of conferences, but sustained over a period of time, or if it's been public and a more charismatic version of that. And then, of course, probably the biggest problem of all was the way in which the security environment changed pretty significantly, in which we moved from that period of the early 2010s where we could see over the horizon that there were risks of great power competition. But at that point, it didn't seem inevitable that we would end up with the world that we're in now, in which the sort of conventional military threats states pose to one another, the ambitions of the major powers, in particular the United States, to retain a region centered around its vision of what the region should look like, and a PRC that most assuredly does not want that and wants a region centered around itself and its vision of what it should look like. And of course, the fact that each side has a version of what the region should look like that is antithetical to the others, in which there is no room for the others. There's no room for compromise in how they might see what the region should look like. Makes doing the business of inclusive cooperative security pretty difficult. And if you sit there and think about what these things are for, if you have a security environment in which the threat of nuclear war between the two major powers is real, in which nationalist impulses prevail, and think about how we all thought, or how, not we in this room, but how the states thought about and managed the pandemic in unbelievably nationalist terms. I mean, it was really striking, frankly, pretty depressing the way in which the policy response to the pandemic was so filtered through a nationalist, narrowly conceived national interest lens. That means that managing the vulnerabilities of globalisation and shared security problems is always going to lose that competition. And so it's very difficult to look forward and think, aha, we just need to write out the next National Party Congress. And of course, that's when these stage of summit's going to flourish, because that's, you know, the broader environment. What are the nature of the security challenges that states face? How are they prioritizing their resources? How do they see what are the tools that they are turning to advance those interests? Cooperative and inclusive approaches to multilateral security cooperation are a long, long, long way down the list, if on the list at all. So what does all this mean? I've gone a bit longer than I'd intended, so I'll probably gallop through this pretty quickly to give some time for Q&A. Probably there's a couple of pretty obvious things that the scope to mitigate great power competition that multilateral security bodies present is pretty limited. And you can see this, for example, where instead of being forums in which the great power, the antagonists or the protagonists of great power competition can quietly mend fences, work out ways of managing competition, these things are becoming forums for that competition itself. They become a platform through which you signal your displeasure and show through finger waggling of various kinds or more that this meeting of foreign ministers, meeting of heads of state and government, whatever it might be, is just another venue in which the competition is being played out. It is not a place in which competition is being managed or risks are being curtailed or mitigated. It's also, I think, a further consequence is that the geopolitical logic of competition is going to prevail. And there are capacities to say, actually, there's other ways of thinking about how competition may play out in which the overarching sort of dominance of a geopolitical way of thinking about interests can be diluted by other ways of thinking about how state interests can be advanced. And of course, if you're in Australia or Indonesia or South Korea looking at all of this, your ability to shape the region more generally and your ability to influence security policy in the region as a whole is, of course, significantly reduced. One of the reasons why countries like Australia have been such enthusiastic proponents of multilateralism over the decades is precisely because it gives smaller states a stake in the game which they otherwise won't have. And of course, there's the fact that the problems of globalization haven't gone away. They're still here. In fact, if anything, they are ever more evident and significant. And yet the mechanisms that we designed to try to tackle these problems have been diluted, if not completely denuded of capacity. So that the problems will be continue to bedevil us, but they will remain largely unaddressed because they'll be subordinated to the competitive geopolitical logic. And think about what we are spending the massive expansion of defence expenditure in this country on. It's not on getting together and solving problems to do with, say, the next pandemic or the security challenges of climate change, but buying nuclear power submarines. So, is there any reason to be positive? Is there a reanimation of the corpse possible? To be perfectly honest, I think it will be very difficult. But what steps might one take? And if you had the ear of a sun-minded foreign minister in the region, or prime minister, president, or defense minister, what might you say? I think there's three quick things to point out. One is, if you value this, you need to invest in it, and it needs leadership, and you need to work with others to provide that. Going along talking from the talking points, and otherwise just behaving in a competitive way is not going to get anything fast. But with some leadership, with some investment, and probably some managing of expectations to say, we will come together and try to do the following 2 things, and that's it. Over time, you might build up the sense that these can deliver something. A second, I think, thing to do is to look at ways in which the sort of middle tier powers can find some common cause on some key issues and work consistently over time to advance those. It's really sort of follow-on point from the second, the third and final point, and that is multilateral security institutions that are inclusive and cooperative do need to present tangible benefits. They can't just talk about things. Talking is important. I have been schooled in ASEANology. I know the process matters. I know the conversation matters, but tangible results have to be delivered if in the environment that we are in, you want to see this kind of mechanism, process, or institution deliver something. Right, I'll shut up there and leave 10-ish minutes for questions, and I'll try to be brief with my answers so I can give lots of answers.
No worries. Okay. We've got a roving mic, so just maybe you want to grab it there. There's a two-chair.
Thank you. How fascinating. I'm Khadija Bashar, and I'm a member of the Institute. Thank you for your speech, and it was just fascinating. I know that you have probably refuted everything that I was going to ask you in the last 2 minutes of your presentation, but I'll still pose it, risking being seen very naive, but I'll still pose it. Is there any chance at all that multilateralism and also the failures of multilateralism in Asia, in our region, might actually be our savior from demise, because it seems that multilateralism somehow provided the ability to predict what was going to happen and easily escalated the environment and conditions for war happening in Europe and in the West. Any chance that that might be the savior of our region?
Look, I'll just be really brief. I mean, one way you could look at multilateralism as a positive thing. I think at the moment what we see is a pretty exclusive competitive dynamic. I mean, the Quad thing is all, if you read any of the Quad communiques, it's what's not there that tells you everything it's about, which is China is in the name, but it's all about China. And it's all about a balancing coalition against China. That's very clear. But just because that's how they are now doesn't mean that's how they have to be forever. And one possibility, the interesting thing about the Quad is the fact that on that kind of core business of doing, not just talking about, but doing a balancing coalition against China, it actually hasn't done a great deal. Where it's been most interesting is talking about beginning to do things in, for example, vaccines, around, we're going to talk about things like climate change. It's in the non-traditional security domains. So it may be that, if my proposition is we need to build up, clear, realistic things that can be done that produce tangible benefits, maybe the way to do it is with small coalitions of states and do things that others can join. But the key is it needs to be something that's that others can join and that everyone can join, not just everyone who is like-minded or everyone who believes in a free and open Pacific. And it's that until we can get past that, I think the capacity to make that broader contribution will be limited. But I think there is possibility. So perhaps I sound more pessimistic, but I partly, the stylistic side. You can't be too compromising. You can be too middle of the road.
Thank you so much. Most interesting. You've convinced me that the talk fests have achieved not very much. What's the solution? If you were put in charge today of fixing the thing quickly, what would you do? And secondly, I want to know, to what extent do you think that US actions have interfered with progress?
Well, on the latter point, it's actually that's relatively easy, which is the US disengaged pretty significantly from under the Bush II administration, particularly the second administration. I think that was quite problematic because you had at that point a US that at that stage was way out in front, but which was talking a reasonable game on this kind of these kinds of cooperative and inclusive dynamics, but not delivering and not showing up and not appearing. And that was and really pretty obviously not that interested in this kind of thing. So I think the contribution that has been problematic, and the fact that the US, I think, for a long period of time, I think it now knows what it wants in the region, which is, I think, to be blunt, it wants the region to remain forever as if it's 1998. I think that's the case. And would that, it'd be nice if that were the case, but it can't. You know, it flies in the face of the reality of Chinese power. But in that interim period, had they had a slightly clearer sense as to the trajectory China was on, and could say, actually, can we carve out a regional dispensation, which would still remain pretty significant in the premier players, but in which China can have a bit more space and use these mechanisms to negotiate and manage that. There may have been space for a different region. It's very difficult to replay these things. But I think they were, by them not engaging at those moments, and still even under the Obama administration, you know, the man who, as I remember Jeff Bader talking in Washington, who was Obama's China advisor in the National Security Council, saying, "Yeah, finally we have the president who knew what ASEAN was. We didn't have to brief him on what it was." Even he was actually, his administration found it difficult to sustain interest in these things, and I think that was a significant problem. Had the US been a sustained and engaged supporter of that, you know, what we're after from an inclusive and cooperative institutional set of bodies, I think we could have gotten a lot more out of them. If you had, the problem is where we are now. You know, if you were dropped into the cockpit, so to speak, of the regional order, it's really difficult to figure out exactly what you do because of the reality on the ground, so to speak. But if you could wind the clock back a little bit, I think the thing to have done is if you wanted to have these institutions or these processes have more of an impact, I think you needed to tackle the problem of multiplication, too many of them, too much shared work programs, too sprawling a kind of ambition, and have them much more focused on doing specific things. I think that's what one might do. A tailored focus, that kind of urban reform, or the clearing of the slums, so to speak, of regional multilateralism, that might have given this stuff a better set of prospects. But of course, you know, even if you wind the clock back, the tidal wave of great power competition could have gone it all anyway, because it is. I mean, you know, one shouldn't understate just how swiftly we've moved and how all-encompassing this competitive dynamic has become. And I think even really well-designed multilateral institutions might have already found this pretty treacherous waters.
Derek, now I come to John.
Derek McGrew, University of Melbourne. Thank you very much, Nick. Or in the context of the more polarized environment in Asia, you've referred to groups such as the Quad and various multilaterals. But what do you think of the global NATO approach? It's more than a unilateral, but it obviously isn't inclusive. And you think it would be, or if such an approach got off the ground, would it be relevant to issues such as Taiwan?
It won't get off the ground. NATO has nothing to contribute to. I mean, the thing with NATO has no assets. NATO is what its members want it to do. And most of its members, last time I looked, can't do much in Asia. So I think the point you're getting at is an interesting one, which is, yeah, if you think forward, do we have a global, multilateral, exclusive, competitive kind of set of dynamics? That's possible, you know, if you think, because I think we've got to settle ourselves in for decades of the US-China rivalry, and you could imagine something like that, big, thick, multilateral organization of military power against China, but it's a few decades off yet, and it won't be centered around the North Atlantic.
Thank you, Nick. John Richardson, for a very interesting discussion. Nick, I don't think you actually established, to my mind, that there was a genuine security multilateralism in Asia. I think there was a nascent move in that direction, but all of the institutional building from the mid-1990s onwards was designed to create an atmosphere of cooperation in which that security cooperation could emerge, and in particular to open up a space for the United States and China to cooperate. And even though I know in the past you've downgraded APEC, one of its signal achievements was to bring Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong into a dialogue. And I would argue that it was critical in terms of establishing subsequent architecture in the region. So going to the point of that nascent security multilateralism, you, I think, highlighted the major issue that there needed to be space for China to evolve, which would require the United States to be open to a level of sharing. And I think you highlighted that that wasn't going to be acceptable to the US, particularly as they did not pay significant attention to it, as it was always a secondary area of focus of their interests. Taking all of those factors into account, I don't think that, however, undermines the desirability of having those institutions in place, because as you highlighted, it's far better to have informed understandings in dialogue than to have nothing at all happening. So yes, the prospect is not positive in any way, because you have two major powers competing for space. But unless you have a mechanism for dialogue, that competition becomes a lot more heated. Appreciate your comment.
Yeah, no, good point. I mean, I think I think I agree with the basic proposition that I was, to a degree, setting up something of a straw man, in the sense that it never got off the ground, and I think that's probably right. And I would also strongly agree with the idea that if we hadn't done anything, so if we had just left the region as it was in 1994 and created no multilateral institution and just relied on conventional bilateral diplomacy and the UN and the odd ASEAN meeting, the region would be a much worse place. I have no doubt about that. I guess my point was that there was a lot of expectation set up around these institutions and processes, partly of their own making. That was the mistake. And I think there was an insufficient focus on that core security component of saying, well, what can we do as a region to build this sense of basic trust and common cause? It's not about creating a EU or anything grandiose, but just a shared sense of what the region ought to look like, and a really kind of basic level, just a sort of shared set of norms, basic principles and rules of the road. And we couldn't even manage that. And I guess that's the core point. And it may be, and again, partly the stylistics of an address like this, it meant that I really wanted to hammer the point. But it may be that with some of these mechanisms, we do have useful platforms, set pieces in which, were the mood to change in Beijing and Washington, they could take up these opportunities. And you wouldn't want to take those off the table. The great example of the unanticipated benefits of APEC was the 2001 meeting after the EP3 incident, where the US, the American aircraft had been harassed by the Chinese and crashed, and caused a big kerfuffle at the time. It looks like nothing now, but a significant amount of tension. And there was who's going to visit whom and how can we restart the relationship? And there's a multilateral meeting where we can bring them together and no one has to lose face. And so there's always these, not always, but because of these, you can have these serendipitous opportunities that provide the the diplomatic ladders, if you like, that can be climbed that allow these things to occur. And you don't, then I wouldn't want to tear them down, but I think I'm really trying to emphasize A, where we're at in terms of the security dynamics, and B, I think put a sense of perspective on realism around how we might go about doing things like this in this context. That's probably the part two. When you give me another membership, I'll do that.
Nick, Nick, thank you. There are more questions I know here and Zoom, but unfortunately we're out of time. It's a sign of a good talk. There's still questions to come. We could go on for a long time. So look, I'd just like to say thank you for all you've done for the Institute. Congratulations on your Fellows Award. It's well deserved and thoroughly well earned. And many thanks for coming, sharing your views. Thank you to the audience here. Thank you for Zoom for all your interest, and wish we could go on longer, but Nick will just have to get you back another time. So please join me in thanking you.